Imagine you're playing a game and you stumble on a cheat code that shouldn't exist. Not a skill thing. Not a strategy thing. A pure exploit. You tap a button sequence and, boom, your account balance jumps. Tap it again. It jumps again. No risk. No grind. No chance of losing. Just a mechanical flaw that turns the rules into a vending machine. Now picture this. The moderators catch you. They see the logs. They see the pile of loot. And instead of banning you, they offer a deal. Pay us a tiny percentage of what you made, and you can keep playing. What do? You pay. Of course you pay. And then you go right back to hitting the buttons, because that isn't a penalty. It's a subscription. It's the cost of doing business. That sounds like a movie plot. But in modern markets, it's closer to a blueprint. Because there's a version of that cheat code that lives inside high finance, where prices move not just from supply and demand, but from what people think supply and demand looks like for the next 5 seconds. The game is the precious metals market. The loot is money pulled out of tiny, repeatable price moves. And the exploit has a name: spoofing. If you've ever watched silver spike, slam back down, and thought, how does that happen so fast? Stay with me. I'm going to show you the exact mechanism, why it worked for years, and why the one thing it can't cheat forever is the physical metal itself. The script doesn't begin by arguing about charts or calling silver volatile. It begins by hijacking your intuition with a metaphor so simple it feels unfair: an infinite money glitch. In a video game, a glitch is not randomness, it's a repeatable exploit. Press the right sequence, stand in the right spot, and coins appear. That's the point of the opening move, to reframe what most people dismiss as market noise into something closer to an engineered environment, where outcomes can be nudged by whoever knows the exploit. The metaphor is doing heavy lifting, because it instantly changes how the audience interprets every candle that follows. A sudden spike and collapse isn't just the market being the market. It becomes a signature, evidence that someone may have pulled a lever, triggered a response, harvested the reaction, then walked away before anyone could prove it. Then comes the moral twist that turns a clever hook into an indictment. When the admins catch the cheater, they don't ban them, they invoice them. In the script's worldview, that is the modern regulatory bargain in one sentence: punishment as a fee, wrongdoing as a line item, and continuity as the real priority. That framing is crucial because it tells the viewer what kind of story this is going to be. Not a rumor thread, not a motivational rant, a case file. The narrator is implicitly saying, we're not here to vibe, we're here to document. And once you adopt that posture, the structure becomes almost inevitable, like a courtroom strategy laid over a market chart. First, you show that something happened and it wasn't normal. Then you put the mechanism on the table, step by step, until even a non-trader can see how the trick works. Then you reveal the paperwork that allowed the trick to persist: settlements, agreements, and the quiet logic of pay and proceed. And only after you've earned the audience's trust with tangible exhibits do you widen the lens into motive. Not just personal greed, but power, currency, credibility, institutional stability, and the incentives that make certain outcomes useful to the system. That's why the opening metaphor isn't decoration, it's architecture. It forces a single question to hang over the entire narrative. Are you watching a free market, or a competitive game where the scoreboard is real, but the rules can be bent? The script positions the viewer as a juror in that trial. Your job isn't to predict tomorrow's price. Your job is to evaluate the pattern. What happens when liquidity is thin? When a wall appears? When the crowd panics? When the wall vanishes? When price snaps back? The promised upgrade is psychological as much as technical. If you stop staring at the number and start tracking the machinery, order book behavior, the gap between paper claims and physical supply, and the incentive structures that reward certain trades, you don't need dramatic conspiracies. You only need repeatable mechanics. And the final constraint that gives the whole frame its bite is the one thing no algorithm can spoof forever: you can't print silver. When paper games meet physical limits, the glitch eventually runs out of room. If the first section was the frame, an infinite money glitch that turns volatility into something repeatable, then the next section is where the story stops sounding clever and starts sounding prosecutable. A glitch is just a narrative until you can point to a document the system itself signed. That's why the script pivots from metaphor to official language and treats it like Exhibit A, an enforcement action that upgrades the claim from conspiracy to record. The tone tightens. The narrator isn't speculating anymore, he's opening a file. In the script's telling, the bank doesn't merely face allegations. It is described as admitting to schemes to defraud precious metals markets. And to a scale so large it reads less like an incident and more like a production line, tens of thousands of unlawful trades across multiple metals. Spanning roughly 8 years. That detail matters because it attacks the audience's most comforting escape hatch. It was just one bad actor. A pattern that runs for years isn't a fluke. A pattern that spans desks, products, and time as a machine. Then the narrator does something sharper than outrage. He introduces moral math. The settlement figure is presented as enormous in headlines, but small relative to the implied upside. And once you place those two numbers in the same frame, the penalty starts to look less like punishment and more like a business expense. A fee, a tax on crime. The script's point isn't simply that wrongdoing happened, it's that the system priced it. You can feel the implication harden. If the cost of getting caught is predictable and survivable, deterrence becomes optional. Compliance becomes a spreadsheet. That's where the story pivots from evidence to the question that's designed to stick in your throat. If this was so serious, why are they still here? Not, why didn't they apologize? But why is the institution still active in the same ecosystem, still operating in the same venues, still plugged into the same pipes where the alleged conduct occurred? Why would a firm that, in this narrative, admitted to defrauding the market still sit close to the infrastructure of silver? Still occupying positions that imply trust? The script doesn't ask these questions to be fair. It asks them to corner you into a suspicion. Continuity is the priority. The market prefers stability over accountability. The machine doesn't get shut down, it gets tuned. And that suspicion becomes the bridge into the next section. Because once you accept the possibility that the system can absorb an admission and keep moving, you're forced into a deeper question. How does the exploit actually work? In real time, on the screen, what is the mechanical sequence that makes normal price action look like a lever you can pull, wall by wall, bid by bid, panic by panic, until an 8-year pattern stops being a mystery and starts being something you can recognize on command? If the second section leaves you with the uncomfortable question, how can an institution admit to fraud and still remain embedded in the same arena? Then the third section answers the only way a serious case file can, by showing you the mechanism. Not vibes. Not, they manipulate. The exact move. In plain language. The kind you can replay in your head the next time a candle snaps. This is where the script slows down on purpose. Because speed is how tricks survive. The narrator wants to be known for doing the opposite. Taking the magic out of the market by exposing the wiring. The exploit is spoofing. And the best way to understand it is to stop thinking in charts and start thinking in a queue. The order book is a public stage where everyone can see what looks like supply and demand. Spoofing is the act of placing a huge order you never intend to execute, purely to change what everyone else believes is about to happen. It's not a trade. It's a signal weapon. In the script's example, price is rising and genuine buyers are stepping up. The bank, if it wants cheaper buys, doesn't fight the market honestly. It manufactures a reason for the crowd to retreat. An algorithm slams in an enormous sell wall at a visible level. Something clean and memorable. Say around $25.10, big enough to look like an incoming flood. Thousands of contracts, the kind of size that, if real, would represent an absurd amount of metal. And that's the point, it doesn't have to be real. It only has to be believable for a few seconds. Because the market is a herd with a scoreboard. People don't just respond to what happened. They respond to what they think is about to happen. When that wall appears, buyers flinch, some cancel bids, some step back, some flip to selling to get out ahead of the dump they think is coming. Liquidity thins on the bid side. The tape turns red, price slides faster than it should. Not because supply arrived, but because fear did. Then comes the reveal that makes spoofing a cheat code. The sell wall disappears. Cancelled, vanished. It was never meant to trade. It was a mirage, phantom supply. placed long enough to redirect real humans and real algorithms into doing the heavy lifting for you. And once price drops into the target zone, the actor does the only part of the sequence that actually needs to be real. They buy. They scoop contracts at lower levels, harvesting the move that the fake order created. This is why the story insists the word volatility is too soft. Volatility sounds like weather. Spoofing is more like stagecraft, props, lighting, timing, and an audience trained to react on cue. The critical takeaway isn't merely that it's unfair. It's that it's repeatable, scalable, and automated, a button combination that can be pressed again and again across sessions, across levels, across years. Which loops back to the question you were left with in Section 2. If the system can price the misconduct and keep the institution inside the arena, then this isn't a one-time scandal. It's an exploit with a known cost, running inside a market that mistakes displayed orders for truth. And once you see how phantom liquidity can move price on demand, the next question becomes inevitable. If the cheat is this mechanical, what kind of legal framework could allow it to persist? And what does that say about who the rules are designed to protect? Once you understand spoofing as a mechanical exploit, phantom supply that can push real buyers and sellers off balance, the obvious question isn't, can it happen? The question is, if it's that repeatable, how does it survive contact with the law? This is where the script stops talking like a trader explaining a trick and starts talking like an investigator reading the rulebook. Because the exploit isn't just a trading move. It's a governance problem, and the story's claim is that the key that kept the engine running wasn't hidden in an algorithm, it was printed on paper. Enter the deferred prosecution agreement. In an ordinary world, the logic is simple: admit fraud, face consequences, individuals go to prison, institutions get carved down, banned out, or broken apart. But the script argues we don't live in that world. At least not when the defendant is systemically important. Here, the institution pays and continues. The DPA is framed as the device that converts criminal exposure into a managed risk, a negotiated outcome that avoids the kind of legal finality that would force a real reset. No existential threat, no permanent removal from the venue. Just conditions, monitoring language, and a settlement number that can be absorbed. And once you see the DPA that way, the settlement figure stops being a punishment and starts behaving like a toll. The narrator leans into a perverse incentive loop. Agencies collect large fines. Those fines become part of institutional budgeting reality. And when budgets quietly learn to expect revenue from penalties, the system's appetite for shutdown outcomes shrinks. It's not even necessary to accuse anyone of corruption for the logic to work. The script's argument is colder than that. It says the structure itself creates moral hazard. If penalties scale as a fraction of gains, then the rational strategy is to keep doing the behavior and reserve capital for the fee. You don't need to win every time. You just need the expected value to stay positive after compliance costs. In that framework, the fine doesn't deter. It prices. It standardizes the cost of getting caught. The story also sharpens the discomfort by contrasting where the money goes. In its telling, victim compensation, if it exists at all, is small relative to total harm. While the bulk of the settlement flows into government coffers, that detail matters because it changes the emotional posture of the viewer. The script wants you to feel that the settlement wasn't designed primarily to make the market whole. It was designed to close the file while preserving continuity. The paperwork becomes the villain, an administrative permission slip that prevents handcuffs and keeps the pipes open. And with that, the tone shifts decisively from a trader cheat to system design. The script is no longer pointing at a few bad actors pressing buttons. It's pointing at an arrangement between powerful institutions. The state tolerates certain outcomes. The bank internalizes the cost. And the public is left watching a market that can be gamed, then normalized, because the rulebook quietly allows the game to continue. Once the script has shown you the mechanics of spoofing and the paperwork that kept the engine alive, it makes a deliberate pivot. It stops asking, how, and starts asking, why. Because if the punishment functions like a fee, if the institution pays and continues, then the story can't stay confined to trader greed or desk culture. A system that tolerates a repeatable exploit for years usually isn't acting by accident. So the narrator opens the next folder. the darker one, and proposes a hypothesis that changes the scale of the entire case. Maybe the light consequences weren't just convenience or corruption. Maybe they were strategic. The argument is built on a simple geopolitical fact. The US dollar is not just a currency. It's a global operating system. Trade, debt, reserves, commodity settlement. So much of the modern financial world depends on confidence that the dollar remains stable, liquid, and credible. And in the script's framing, gold and silver are the anti-dollar not because they're better, but because they act like truth meters. When fiat credibility weakens, metals tend to speak up. They don't file press releases. They don't argue. They reprice. In that sense, the metals chart becomes a public report card, an unfiltered signal that says, the currency is losing purchasing power, or policy credibility is slipping, or stress is rising under the surface. The narrator wants you to feel the danger of that signal if you're sitting in charge of the system. A disorderly spike in precious metals can look like a vote of no confidence, broadcast globally in real time. So the script asks the uncomfortable question it has been preparing you to accept. What if suppressing metals isn't merely a trader's hustle? What if it's treated, at the margin, as a form of national interest management? Not an official policy you can quote, but an incentive landscape where certain outcomes are useful. In that landscape, a big bank isn't just a criminal actor. It can become an instrument that helps preserve a currency narrative, keeping the truth meter quiet, smoothing the optics, preventing feedback loops that start with price signals and end with confidence breaks. This is where the story's style shows its hand. It's a documentary move. You earn trust with documented wrongdoing. Then you widen the lens into motive. The narrator isn't claiming the transcript itself proves state-level intent. Instead, he presents it as the plot thickens, expansion, an interpretation that becomes possible once you accept the smaller facts. Structurally, this section is a bridge from micro to macro. Spoofing is the micro, the button sequence that creates phantom supply. The deferred prosecution agreement is the governance layer, the legal architecture that turns fraud into a managed cost. Now comes the regime layer, the idea that the incentive to control metals could be larger than quarterly bonuses. It could be tied to credibility, geopolitical leverage, reserve status, and the stability narrative that keeps the system functioning. Whether you accept that leap or not, the script uses it to answer the question that's been haunting the last two sections. Why would the system tolerate manipulation? Because, in this frame, the alternative is more dangerous. A loud metals market is not just a trade. It's a signal. And signals, when they point at fiat weakness, don't just move portfolios, they move history. If the previous section widens the motive from trader profit to currency power, the next widening is more concrete and, in a way, more dangerous, because it moves from narratives you can debate to logistics you can count. The script essentially says, you can't understand a truth meter like silver if you only study the screen. At some point, the truth meter has to touch reality. Bars, vaults, inventory, delivery, and that's where the conflict of interest theme lands with the weight of a steel door closing. After walking you through the paper-side exploit and the legal loophole, the narrator drags your attention into the physical ecosystem and asks a sharper kind of question. What happens when the same institution that helps shape paper price discovery is also positioned as custodian over vast physical stockpiles, through a major ETF structure, sitting close to the metal itself? The script frames this as informational superiority masquerading as normal infrastructure. Because custody isn't just storage. It's visibility. It's timing. It's knowledge of flows, what comes in, what goes out, what gets swapped, what gets delayed, what gets rebalanced. In a market where the ultimate constraint is finite metal, the party closest to the vault has an advantage that can't be replicated by someone staring at charts from the outside. And here the story makes a strategic comparison: enforcement. In its telling, focused intensely on futures market spoofing, the obvious paper crime, while leaving the physical layer comparatively untouched. That absence becomes its own exhibit. The narrator points to a list of missing investigations, not as proven accusations, but as unanswered questions the public is rarely invited to ask. Leasing arrangements, inventory visibility, the rules around custody, The line between administrative handling and market advantage. The image that emerges is deliberately unsettling. The fox guarding the henhouse, not because it's dramatic, but because it's structurally plausible. If you can see vault movements and ETF flows, you may be better positioned to anticipate scarcity, manage delivery stress, or hedge paper exposure with physical control. You don't need a grand conspiracy for the edge to exist. You only need asymmetry. This is the glitch in its purest form. The script implies, control the vault, influence the paper, and you can shape the narrative of price. Then treat paper side penalties as a fee if you're caught leaning too hard on the mechanism. It's the same logic as before, just upgraded from an algorithmic bluff to a logistical mode. And it intensifies the viewer's sense that the game isn't rigged in one window, on one exchange, in 1 week. It's layered. Paper claims above, physical constraints below, and a set of institutions sitting at the junction, able to translate one layer into advantage and the other. Most importantly, this section quietly sets the fuse for the endgame. Because once you accept that physical supply is the ultimate constraint, the question stops being, what's the spot price? The question becomes, who actually controls the metal, and under what rules, when the screen price and the real-world cost of an ounce start to diverge. If Section 6 is where the story moves from screen mechanics to physical advantage, vaults, custody, asymmetry, then Section 7 does something even more damning. It supplies the human fingerprint. Because at this point, a skeptical viewer can still retreat into a familiar comfort. Maybe this is all technical overreach. Maybe a few trades crossed a line. Maybe it's being dramatized. The script anticipates that escape hatch and closes it the old investigative way, not with more charts, but with culture evidence. Not what the market did, but how the people inside the market talked while doing it. This is where chat logs matter. The narrator doesn't present them as shocking because they're theatrical. He presents them as shocking because they're casual. The tone isn't panic, or secrecy, or, we messed up. The tone is routine. Traders joke, brag, and treat spoofing like a tool in the kit, something you pull out the way you'd pull out a calculator. That mundanity is the point. A crime you whisper about can be a one-off. A behavior you laugh about is a habit. And habits don't belong to one rogue guy. Habits belong to desks, teams, incentives, and institutions that have normalized the behavior through repetition. In the script's framing, this culture segment is designed to kill the rogue trader defense at the root. If the conduct is repeated, socialized, and casually discussed, then the problem isn't a single actor slipping. It's a structure that rewards the output and tolerates the method. It implies management didn't just fail to notice, it didn't feel compelled to change the environment that made the behavior profitable. The market stops looking like an arena of fair competition and starts looking like an adversarial system with asymmetry baked in. Some players aren't just better at trading, they're better positioned to shape what everyone else believes is true. This is also where the documentary arc deepens emotionally. Because numbers can feel abstract. Tens of thousands of trades sounds big, but it still lives on paper. Culture makes it personal. It's one thing to hear that unlawful orders were placed. It's another to picture professionals laughing about moving the crowd, baiting stops, or crushing the weaker side because they know the herd will flinch. The narrator wants the viewer to feel the shift from markets are competitive to markets can be predatory. Not as a melodramatic claim, but as a lived reality for anyone trading against informational and infrastructural advantage. Technically, this section functions as reinforcement, cement poured over the foundation that the spoofing explanation and the DPA laid down. It makes the machine feel real because it shows the humans operating it without shame. And it quietly sets up the next pivot. Because once you accept that the behavior was normalized, once you see it as a desk habit rather than an accident, the motive can evolve. What began as offensive manipulation for profit can, under pressure, become defensive manipulation for survival. The same tools, the same culture, but now the stakes aren't just bonuses. They're solvency. Once you accept that the behavior was normalized, desk culture treating spoofing like routine, the story is free to make its most important escalation. Motives can change without changing tools. The same lever that was pulled for profit can later be pulled for survival. This is the pivot the script builds toward in Part 3. And it's where the narrative stops being just a scandal and starts feeling like a countdown. Earlier, manipulation is framed like an ATM. You harvest the crowd, you skim liquidity, you print edge. It's cynical, but it's optional. In the script's next frame, it becomes something else, a shield. Because the claim is that paper obligations and short exposure have grown so large that a sustained price rise isn't merely inconvenient, it's existential. There is, in this telling, a level where the math stops behaving and starts breaking. A kill zone, where rising price turns paper promises into a solvency event. And when the stakes move from quarterly performance to institutional survival, suppression stops looking like a tactic and starts looking like a reflex. The script paints a cycle that repeats like clockwork. Physical demand rises, not in a sensational way, but in the quiet way that matters: industrial pull, steady accumulation, and large buyers in major demand hubs. Price pressure builds as real metal is sought. Then the paper machine responds with what the narrator has already taught you to recognize: visible walls of supply that appear on command. The kind of size that scares bids off the book and caps the move. The point isn't that every rally is fake. The point is that when the market approaches levels that threaten the paper structure, the response becomes mechanical, an algorithmic lid. And in that picture, the currency being purchased isn't silver. It's time. Time to roll positions. Time to finance. Time to manage exposure without admitting the constraint. Time to keep the scoreboard believable. But the script's most powerful move in this section is the irony it introduces: suppression can backfire. Because silver is not a video game resource. It is a physical input with finite availability. And when you hold the price artificially low, you don't merely control sentiment. You create a bargain signal to the one group that can't be scared off by a candle: physical buyers. Lower price doesn't necessarily reduce demand. It can concentrate it. It encourages hoarding, stacking, and industrial pre-buying, because people know an undervalued physical asset doesn't stay undervalued forever. The narrator invokes a simple historical logic, often summarized as Gresham's law, to give that intuition a narrative spine. When good money is undervalued, it disappears from circulation. People don't hand it back cheaply. They remove it from the system. So the very act meant to keep the market calm can tighten the physical noose. A suppressed screen price can accelerate real-world drain, shrinking float, stressing inventories, and making delivery pressure worse over time. Structurally, this is the turning point where the predator becomes the prey. The machine that once printed money by engineering reactions now locks its operators into a fight against physics. Algorithms can cancel orders, settlements can price misconduct, narratives can buy time, but none of that manufactures ounces. And once the story reaches that realization, the next question isn't whether suppression exists, it's what happens when the system runs out of time. If Section 8 is the moment the script turns the screws, suppression buying time while accelerating the physical drain, then the final section is where it cashes out the entire thesis in one brutal idea: time runs out. Not in a dramatic, movie explosion way, but in the cold, accounting sense of the phrase. The story has been aiming at this landing from the first metaphor. Because every infinite money glitch has a boundary condition. Silver is not printable. You can spoof the book, roll the paper, and settle the scandal. You cannot conjure ounces. So the endgame is framed as a clearing failure disguised as normal operations. The script imagines a world where the physical float, the metal actually available for delivery, approaches zero relative to the stack of claims sitting above it. Delivery stress stops being a rumor and becomes a logistical fact. And in that moment, the paper pricing mechanism loses its core function. It can no longer clear the market honestly. A market clears when a price emerges that convinces sellers to sell and buyers to stop buying. But if physical holders refuse to part with metal at screen prices, because premiums and scarcity are screaming louder than the quote, then the screen stops being priced